Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Moira Welsh, and I'm a journalist with the Toronto Star newspaper. We're pretty pleased to have all of you. We have had a huge amount of interest in this event, with nearly 1,800 people registering for it. So we've got some really interesting questions and discussions coming ahead. So glad that you can all be here with us today. I'm also very excited to announce that this is the launch of the Star's new podcast called How to Live to 100 or Die Trying. Our first episode launched on Monday, and it was about ageism. And we will be running 8 episodes over 8 weeks. So we hope that you find us wherever you enjoy finding your favorite podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, or thestar.com. It's a really interesting conversation we're going to be having on the podcast. As I said, we started with aging or ageism, and we got insight from 80-year-old Mary Hines, who has long advocated for older adults. In later episodes, we will discuss serious issues of life that will be affecting many of us as we grow older, including housing, work, affordability of longevity, and ultimately a good death. So we've got some really, really interesting discussions coming forward. And I just want to give a shout out to a woman named Peggy who read about the title of the podcast, Peggy from Burlington. She called the Star to say that she is about to turn 98, and she was happy to share some of her insights on reaching almost 100, but she's having a really good time, she says. So I thought I would pass that information on. Today, the Star, we'd like to thank Jenna Call, our sponsor, for their support in this live event. One guest will receive a gift basket with a 1-year supply of Jenna Call products, which support joint health. The Star will contact the winner after this event via email. Today, we are joined by Dr. Samir Sinha, a geriatrician with Sinai Health and University of Health Network, and Director of Health Policy Research at TMU's National Institute on Aging. Laura Tamblyn Watts is the CEO of CanAge, lawyer, academic, and author of the international bestseller, Let's Talk About Aging Parents. We're thrilled to have both of our guests with us today. And we're about to delve into some complicated issues with a lot of questions, and including questions from viewers. There were hundreds of questions from viewers, so we're going to get there quickly. But first, Laura and Dr. Sinha, what excites you about the strong likelihood that you will one day be a very old person? Laura, let's start with you.
Well, we've never been very old people before, so this is uncharted territory. I'm excited because I don't want to die and I'd like to live. So there's a certain humor associated with that. But from a societal perspective, this is really something we've never done before. This is something that's happened in the last 100 years. And so we're just now learning, is a midlife crisis really a crisis because that's the age that we used to die at? How many ways can we invent ourselves? What things are we going to create? And what is our wisdom that we're going to be bringing forward? So it is really an exciting time.
Dr. Sinha?
No, and I'm really excited actually, because I've just turned 49. I'm looking forward to my 50th. I'm even thinking of calling it a halfway there party because, again, I have a number of patients who are now 100 years or older. They're known as centenarians, and I really hope that if I play my cards and everything goes well, that I might join them in that club. And as Laura was saying, if you go back to 1900, our life expectancy as Canadians was 51 years of age. When we actually created Medicare in this country, we were a bunch of 27-year-olds, and the average age of a Canadian, again, or the average life expectancy was in our high 60s. Now Canadians on average can expect to live at least 82 years of age, but many more of us are going to reach, kind of those ages of our 90s and even possibly become centenarians. And so I think this is what excites me, because with all my older patients, with the older peoples in my lives, I always admire them because they are so much more well put together in terms of having so much lived experience. They know what to sweat, they know what not to worry about. And especially in these troubling times, I just look to them to say, do I need to worry about this? Do I not? And they just seem to have so much more experience, so much more wisdom. And I can't wait to be like that.
Do you think, just to follow up on that, do you think they've been considering their lives, I guess, for a while as older people, but just to follow up, is it something you're seeing younger people start to consider these issues as well, younger demographics that are also growing older? Laura, can you speak to that?
I am, and I think we're starting to talk about things like menopause, and that is part of the conversation of getting older, right? I mean, it was taboo even 5 years ago. We're starting to have those conversations about women's health. We've talked a bit more about men's health and men's sexual health with the advent of things like Viagra. But at a larger point, what it's talking about is maybe I don't need to have this kind of dried up old idea of a quality of life. Maybe there's ways of reinvigorating. Maybe there's ways of having joint resilience. What am I really afraid of? Am I afraid of aging? Not really. Am I afraid of being in pain? Yes. Am I afraid of losing my memory? Yes. Am I afraid of irrelevance? Yes. So it is really exciting to see that as we're making lifestyle changes, as people are feeling more optimistic and we're starting to know what the recipe is for good aging, people can have really rich, healthy lives for much, much longer.
Suppose that point with the reality that there's a darker side of aging just because of societal biases. And the majority of Canadians will likely experience ageism. And before anyone dismisses that as irrelevant, it's worth pointing out that extensive research shows that it can be quite debilitating to our lives, emotionally, cognitively, and physically. So my question for Dr. Sinha is, from a health perspective, can you explain the impact of ageism? What does it do to us?
Yeah, so again, ageism is that last form of kind of discrimination. Again, discrimination based on age can cut both ways, but it's mainly directed, kind of at older ages and older age groups. And when we think about sexism, racism, well, those aren't good. But somehow ageism is acceptable in terms of where we naturally think about older people being slower, not as quick, not as important, not as valuable. And so when we start othering people and actually making it look like, getting older is actually just a period of decline and worthlessness, for example, there's two things that happen. One is we can exclude people and we make people not feel wanted. So then why bother go out and engage in our community? Why stay active? Why participate and do that? And it also cuts, internally, where people say, well, what's the point of growing older? It's just going to be a period of decline. And so with that internalized ageism that people feel, they sometimes actually holds them back. It holds us all back as a society, because then people say, well, why bother doing things? Why get engaged? Nobody wants me and no one's going to be helpful. So my key message is that ageism holds us all back. And when it holds us back, it means if we're not as socially connected, if we're not remaining physically active, if we're not thinking about our health, our wellness, and the contributions that older people do make to our society. They're the biggest providers of childcare. They are still very active in the labor force. They're still doing many things that are important, including making sure younger generations have some knowledge and wisdom of that experience to kind of think forward. Ageism really it can be quite ugly, because it can really hold us all back as a society, and it's something that we need to really think more about, because it's not healthy, and in fact, it can really damage our health and well-being in many ways as a society and individually.
Do you find, like, you've been very eloquent on that point, but when you're out talking to people or talking to patients, do you find that people are asking questions about that? Your patients, are they talking about ageism, or is it more just they're describing sort of the impacts of it?
I don't think many people in our society label it as ageism as such, saying like, I've been a victim of ageism. But I think when, we do an annual survey through the NIA where we actually ask about ageism, and people experience what we call everyday ageism in a whole bunch of different ways. In healthcare settings, I see it quite a bit. A number of patients, when they see me, they'll say, my doctor says this is happening because I'm old. And they said, is it because I'm old, or is it actually something else that's being dismissed because of my age? And unfortunately, too often I find people having situations where I'm like, well, that's actually not a normal part of aging. This is actually something we need to actually deal with, and we can actually treat and actually make better. And so I think this is where ageism can be problematic in healthcare, where we sometimes just we used to say, for example, if you were older than 65, you were not getting a transplant. Now, older people disproportionately represent the number of people getting transplants because they actually can sometimes do better than younger people just due to their own just to the fact that being older, you have less of an immune response that will reject that organ. So we're all of a sudden realizing that these cutoffs and these things that we'd say don't give that person access to the ventilator because what's the point? We're now starting to see people, at least in healthcare, starting to realize that we shouldn't necessarily use age as a cutoff point, but more about how we're functioning, how we're doing, what's the status of our overall health and well-being as opposed to our age. And so I think we're starting to see it change, but there's still a lot of notions that are held quite tightly within all of us that I think are naturally tending to look at being older as being worse off.
That's super interesting to contemplate, actually. Question for Laura. If we're lucky enough to live for a very long time, hopefully those extra years will offer us pleasure. But from a societal perspective, how can we fight against ageism now to make it better for ourselves and for people who are there already?
I think of this question in a couple of different phases. I mean, at the individual level, there is a quick recipe for it. The first is have a purpose. It doesn't need to be the same purpose as your friend or your neighbor, but you have to have a purpose. You got to get a reason, not just to get up in the morning, not just to be busy. It's not a hobby, although it could be. It's a sense of internalized purpose. I think of purpose as being, service plus interest, right? Something that feels like you're giving back. Could be taking care of grandkids, could be a sense of gardening for your community, could be going to work or starting up a new company or whatever it is, but you have to have that sense. It's one of the most important things to aging well. And when we have ageism, pushing against that, telling us that we don't have value, that you can't start that company, that it doesn't matter what you do, and that anything that you tell your kids, they could have looked up on Google. Like, these are very negative things. If you take that negativity in, you actually get sicker. We've seen that with racism, gender, and so on. When you internalize something, it physically affects your body and your emotional well-being. So you got to fight against it, have a sense of purpose. Beyond that, it's important to question, is it about years or fears? Really? And if you see ageism in the workforce, which is one of those areas people are really starting to talk about now, I'm not getting the investment in my training for AI because they see that I'm 55 and they're not going to invest it. I'm worried I can't get another job when I'm 60. And so there's a lot of reality associated with some of that. People don't want to hire me because my boss would be younger, some of those social dynamics. Is it a fear that they have or that you have, or is it real? And it is important to then, once you identify that it may be fear, whose fear is it? Is it the boss's fear that you're not going to be a good worker? Well, it's probably not going to be true. What is it about that? Are there concerns? So pushing back against that by saying, is it about my birth date, or is it about what I'm worried about, or is it about what somebody else is worried about, helps you just take a little bit of a moment, a little cognitive behavioral therapy moment, identify it and call it out is really important, not just accepting that you're getting treated in a certain way.
Do you think people can do that? That's a scary thing to do, perhaps, but it's
I
important.
do actually. That's one of the things I'm starting to get excited about. If you'd asked me that question even 5 or 10 years ago, I might have given you a bit more of a depressed answer about it. But you're seeing a lot of conversations about women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. We're starting to see representation on TV and cultural media. And it's not that I think cultural media is what's changing it. It's just that there has to be an interest and an audience for people to produce things, right? So I see it as sort of a bellwether as a result of people's interests and so on. People are also, looking at some of the realities around their financial well-being, what keeps them interested, what they want to do, and how they want to live. And I think that since the pandemic was such a terrible moment for everybody, but especially difficult for older people or people growing older, it really captured some of those younger older people 50s, 60s, early 70s, and said, I'm actually going to start being really purposeful about how I'm going to be treated, how I'm going to treat other people, what I want to do with my life, and that sort of sense of meaning. I think a lot of people took some time, but I think not just older people, but people growing into age really challenged themselves. And I think that that's starting to continue.
And I just wanted to kind of pick up on that because, what Laura said as well was, one of the things from the pandemics, we saw a lot of older workers leave the workforce. And these weren't, and they could do so because they had financial security. We saw that kind of within healthcare settings where people were just kind of I've been working as a nurse or a doctor for 30 something years, just keep chugging along. And I think the pandemic gave a lot of people time to say, am I being valued as an older worker in the workspace? Does this bring joy, or are there other things I can be doing, now with my life? And so we actually saw a lot of, one of the reasons we've had significant labor shortages, as a result of the pandemic, is a lot of folks who were just, older workers who didn't need to continue working, but were doing it, just because it was something to do, actually use that opportunity to say, wait a minute, why am I here? And what really brings me purpose and joy? And that's why we talk about, as Laura was saying, of ageism in the workforce, ageism if you're mobile and you can do what you want to do, you're going to figure out, I'm going to do something where I'm respected and where I have a purpose and I have a role that brings me joy. And I think more of us kind of figuring that out is going to be helpful for how we move forward.
So interesting. There's a real shift underway, and I want to talk about that a little further along in this conversation. But Dr. Sinha, there have been hundreds and hundreds of questions come in from our attendees, and a lot of them are asking medical questions, strong interest in learning about protections against osteoporosis or cognitive decline. Some are asking about ways to live without pain from, for example, arthritis. Others are curious about the impact of alcohol on our bodies and brains. And since it is never too late to change our errant ways, can you suggest some changes that we can do at any age to sort of support these concerns, or to manage them at least?
Yeah, I remember when I was a young kid, my older brother, he had this lovely phrase. He said, "Remember, Samir, your body is a temple, not a fun house," right? And I always love that quote because it's all these sorts of lessons or these phrases or that good motherhood and apple pie advice we got when we were younger. They're actually really turning out to be true and correct. I think a lot of us are now realizing, as we're aging as a society and likely going to be living a long life, we're like, I don't want to live it in disability. I want to be able to be active and able, so I can travel, I can, go and volunteer, I can play with the grant, I can do whatever I want. And I think as people are starting to realize, like, so what do I need to do to keep my joints in good order? Like, how do I stave off dementia, for example? Most people actually thought that dementia is an inevitable part of aging. Surprise, actually 45% of cases of dementia can actually be prevented or delayed, for example. So now that we're learning these things, I think people are asking these good questions. So what should I be doing? And, there's no magic pill out there. I'll tell you this. It's actually these motherhood and apple pie things. It's staying active, physically active. We know it's 150 minutes a week. And people say, what's the right type of exercise? I'm like, it's the one you're most likely going to do. But we know resistance and balance exercise are great ways to deal with arthritis, but also to prevent joints, declining and us staying physically active. It's about staying socially connected, for example. So making sure that you are staying socially engaged with other people, that you're building those networks that can perform networks of care for you in future, but also ways to keep you socially engaged and socially active. It's making sure you're not smoking. It's making sure that you're eating and drinking in moderation. Again, I'm not saying don't have those chocolates, don't have that glass of wine, but it's about temple, not funhouse, right? So it's not that saying you have to be a monk, nothing against monks, but it's also saying, just be respectful, kind of your body. It's these sorts of things that we're learning over time, that are helping us to give a list. And one of the campaigns we launched to the National Institute on Aging, given the fact that 45% of dementia cases can be prevented or delayed, is called smallstepsbigdifference.ca. It actually lists the 14 things the Lancet Commission has said, if you do these things, you can actually help prevent or reduce your risk of dementia. And again, there are things that actually help you in so many other ways. Making sure your blood pressure is under control. If you're middle-aged and have high cholesterol, get it treated. Make sure that if you have hearing loss or vision loss, you get it corrected, because all these things can help reduce the risk of falls, can reduce the risk of dementia. All these things that I just talked about, they all add up to actually helping to improve your health span, and make sure that while you're living longer years, more of those years are quality years as well.
Laura, I have a question from one of our attendees, and her name is Jacqueline S. And she's asking if loneliness of so many older people is getting the attention it deserves. And she says that experts name it as a negative factor, but people don't really discuss what to do about it. Now, I know that Dr. Sinha just gave some really great suggestions, but if you just sort of drill down into the specific issue of loneliness and isolation, and maybe if you can even tell us the difference in the meaning of each of those terms.
So this is a terrific entrance into the stuff you can do beyond eat, right, and exercise, which, it's probably not the first time we've all heard that, right? But one of the most important things we can do is call out loneliness. And you talked about social isolation and loneliness. They're connected, but they're not the same thing. Probably all of us have had the experience of being in a big crowd somewhere or a big party somewhere, maybe even over the holidays, and feeling really lonely inside, even though you're surrounded by people. You were able to get to the event, you were able to get dressed for the event, you're able to participate in the event, but you feel really disconnected. You feel really sad and alone to yourself, right? Social isolation tends to be much more of a physical separation, or the cultural areas. You might be able to go to the party if you knew about the party. Someone invited you to the party. You physically could get to the party. You weren't worried about incontinence. You weren't worried about, getting back for your medication. You weren't worried about the fact that you couldn't get up that ramp or those stairs. And then all of a sudden your world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can be getting that feeling, that isolation, even if it looks like things are busy around you. So it's not just necessarily that one guy in the woods that nobody talks to. It could be your neighbor. I'll never forget that study that came out with StatsCan. It was 2018, and it's not better now. That's the lead on it. In 2018, StatsCan did a study and found that 20% of Canadian seniors, this is over 65, I'm not talking people are 95, do not have a single person to reach out to, even in the case of an emergency, like I have a health episode or something, someone has fallen and I can't call. Not a 20%, and that number is getting worse, not better. And so if we're feeling lonely, it's important to remember that this is a shared experience. And quite famously, the UK created a ministry of loneliness. And it is its own kind of epidemic. And I think that many of us had that experience of social isolation and loneliness during the pandemic, and we don't want to think about it anymore. But most of the things that we did during the pandemic to stay connected are things that really do work. It is the Zoom call. It is continuous learning. It is the sense of trying a new thing, even if you're not good at it. It is, saying hi to your neighbor next door, even if you're in a big city and you mostly don't do that. A smile makes a difference. My next book is on aging relationships, because that's another thing that we have to talk about. It may be that you're doing okay, but your partner, your spouse, or your best friend or your mom may not be doing okay. And even as you're getting older, maybe together, that relationship may not be as healthy as it once was. You got to exercise your relationships as much as you exercise your body and your mind. And so it's important to remember that you check in. My husband and I always say there's three of us in our marriage, right? You, me, and the relationship. And part of what's important about that is you may be doing okay individually, but your relationships or your social connections or your friendships, they may be suffering. And so thinking about them as a separate entity that you're taking care of really can help. The last thing I'll say is so small. Smile and say hi to people, even if they give you the weird look, right? We're Canadian, and it is actually important. We know, research says, Lancet, if you smile at someone and you say hi and you make a connection of sort of 3 to 10 seconds with your eyes and nod, even if you don't actually say anything else, it makes a big difference. And, pet the dogs as they go by. That physical connection and dog walking is one of the best things you can do to overcome loneliness and social isolation, oddly.
That's great. Dr. Sinha, financial well-being is another really important issue, and we're going to be living longer, so how do we afford to, maintain ourselves during these extra years? And the National Institute on Aging has done surveys that show that a lot of people who are not even ready to retire by the so-called traditional retirement age, but they don't have savings, or they have few $1,000s in their savings. So what do those surveys by the NIA teach us about how to prepare for financial health, or what's coming our way if we do not prepare?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about the importance of staying physically well and also our emotional and social well-being. These are two, key elements that really help set us up for, a good older age. But that third piece that makes that triad, or I sometimes call it the Bermuda Triangle of aging, if you don't get it right, is that financial security. So that's why a lot of the work that we do at the NIA is focused on health and social well-being, but also financial security. Because when you look at the stats, they're pretty scary. And so when we do our annual survey, for example, we know that there are a number of Canadians, of working age who are not sure if they're going to be able to afford to retire. Because if we think about traditional retirement age being, say, 65 years of age, we know that you have at least about 20 years of life expectancy ahead of you. And many people will live beyond that. So the question is, how are you making ends meet now? And are you also, thinking about what your financial plan is? Because if you're hoping for just Canada Pension Plan and old age security and guaranteed income supplement, those weren't meant to be your sole sources of support when you retire. And the scary part is that we have, upwards of a quarter of working Canadians who say they're not sure they're going to be able to afford to retire. And we also have a significant number of Canadians, this is the stat that scares me the most. It says, the average Canadian, retiring, the median amount saved in their savings accounts only about $5,000. So again, some people have done a lot better than 5,000, but when the median amount that that an older person who's retiring has about 5,000 in their account, that means a lot of us are not going to be financially prepared. And the reason I focus on this is because if you don't have the finances you need to live independently, rent doesn't stay the same. Right. Our costs of living are going to continue to increase, and we might have additional health and other expenses that we want. And if we can't afford, the food that we want, if we can't afford to transportation to get around our communities, that can then actually further cause more isolation and loneliness. Not because you don't want to go to the party, but now you can't even afford to get out there to call an Uber or to drive a car because you can't afford the gas, whatever the case is. So that's why it's really important to not only think about our physical, emotional, and social well-being, but also from a young age start thinking about, gosh, I could live to 100. And if I could, then what do I need to start thinking about financially so that I can actually make sure that I'm financially as well prepared as possible?
Yeah, it's such an important topic. And Laura, you joined me on our podcast episode, which will be coming up in the next week or so, on a discussion around work and how we're going to be, many of us will be working longer and for many good reasons other than financial, but finances are a big part of that. But I think I'll let attendees hopefully tune into that episode and hear that discussion for themselves. But one of the points that we discussed, and I love the way you described it, was the value among older workers of crystallized intelligence. What does that mean? Can you tell our attendees today what that means?
Very broadly, there's two kinds of intelligence that we measure. There's many ways of thinking about this, but fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And crystallized intelligence is your book smarts. It's stuff you learned, right? Someone asked me the other day about the general quadratic equation, and I knew it. I didn't know where my keys were. I actually was looking for my keys, but I said, oh, x equals negative b plus or minus the root of b squared minus 4c, blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, where did that come from? Like, I haven't thought about the general quadratic equation since grade 11, essentially, but it's baked in there. It tends to be long-term, and it's stable. It grows and then sort of stays quite stable. It doesn't decline very much, unlike fluid, which is stuff you're learning all the time, and it kind of peaks about 27, and it's sort of a downhill. So crystallized intelligence is also not just, things like the general quadratic equation, but it's cultural norms, it's lived experience. I had an opportunity to do a global meeting in the fall, and I learned from colleagues about how a small community was saved because of farming techniques that had been used 50, 60, and 70 years ago. So much of the climate change and so much reliance on technology and gasoline and fuel products meant the community couldn't do it that same way anymore, and they were having all these terrible floods and droughts. And it was that older person, that elder in the community that said, oh, 60 years ago, we had episodes like this similarly, and we did different things with the tranches and saved the community, and now that information, that library of elderhood is being really extracted and written down. Yeah, I wrote a paper called My Grandmother is Google, right? Because now if you know things or want to find things, maybe it's your grandmother is now AI. But actually, it's not true. So much of those cultural norms, social norms, key learning, strategies, and extrapolative information. So if you're in a business environment or you're with somebody for problem solving, one of the things that we know is that younger people have sometimes less good problem solving techniques, because less face-to-face engagement, less learning. And there is something about having learned, been through this too shall pass, and how people's feelings and emotions are connected. And that's why multidisciplinary teams work so well. But unless you have older workers there with that good crystallized intelligence, you're missing a huge amount of social, cultural, and emotional strength. And that we know and has been measured by the World Economic Forum, the OECD, the UN, my organization and the AARP did it, and have found that with that crystallized intelligence on your workforce, you're going to be more productive. Your younger people are going to be happier, and you're going to have much better sort of a thought about your brand or your marketing. So every aspect gets better. You need the crystallized as well as the fluid.
It's interesting. I know it's a term already used, but somebody could brand that for older workers, perhaps.
It's true.
And, market them that way. Question for Dr. Sinha. Acknowledging, as we have discussed, that we all have different physical abilities and health issues, and things can change at any time unexpectedly. Do you think that the growing focus on fitness, preparation for our older years among the younger people who are now acknowledging that they are aging, do you think that can change their experience when they reach old age if they start preparing now in a concerted way? Will we see a different response?
Absolutely. I think what we're learning now, and I think, as you say, are younger age groups actually participating in more fitness than previous, when we were younger? Like probably, maybe, there's certainly, I live in downtown Toronto. I see a lot more gyms, a lot more people, younger people being physically active. So maybe that's my neighborhood. Maybe that's what I see. But I think the key is that we like to always say it's never too late and it's never too early to start actually doing the things you can do to, say, prevent dementia, to do those things. So again, for older viewers out there saying, gosh, I've never done any exercise, have I missed the boat? No. If you want to get out there and walk, and go for a walk, that's actually how you start. And so when younger people are starting earlier, they're getting what I call longevity dividends, right? So it's this idea that the more you stay physically active, the more you stay socially engaged, the more education, the more crystallized intelligence that you start developing at a younger age. Those things all have benefits. Like there's no bad downsides about them. It almost kind of sets you up with a greater likelihood of success, because if you start, kind of eating well and exercising and drinking in moderation, kind of doing those sorts of things, it will hopefully stave off, chronic health issues like high blood pressure, heart disease, lower your cancer risk, those sorts of things. And all of those things cumulatively can reduce your risk of dementia. They can reduce your chance of developing arthritis. They can develop, those other chronic illnesses that I mentioned. And so all of those things can actually have that payoff. It's part of the reason why fewer people today are actually living with dementia than we imagined would be living with dementia 20 years ago. Now, yes, there are more people living with dementia than ever before. That's because age is the greatest risk factor. But because of those things that we've now been doing, those positive steps, that's partly why we're living longer lives than ever before. That's why, there's an expanded health span and an expanded lifespan. But this is why we actually think that if we continue to pursue these things, more of us are going to live into not only now the average life expectancy is 82, but to our late 80s, our early 90s. That's why I'm hoping that if all goes according to plan, not only what I do, but, as long as the great creator doesn't get me hit by a bus this afternoon, I'm hoping that I might be able to make it to 100 as well. It's a goal that I've set. I know, maybe that's not going to happen, but it's kind of fun to think about, wow, I've got so many years of life ahead of me. So that's why as I approach my 50th birthday, I am thinking, part of my my winter break here was, having chats with my partner about what are we going to be doing in future. I love Laura's comment about he, me, and our relationship, right? Thinking about how do we keep that strong and well, but also we had conversations about how do we stay socially connected? How do we stay physically better? How do we think about our financial well-being? Because again, it's kind of neat when you have that target and that goal and knowing that there are things we can actively do to help us live longer and healthier and socially connected lives.
One of the easiest things you can do besides eat right and exercise is tell yourself, these are the good days. This is a real thing. So the longest ever study on happiness, which is done out of Harvard, went and tried to ask what's called hedonic levels. So they look at people who'd won the lottery and people who had bad things, and people who won the lottery felt better for a while and people who had bad things felt worse for a while. But kind of on the end, they wherever you are kind of baseline as an up or down person is kind of what you'd return to. So this giant study looked at what can we do to actually change that baseline and how does that baseline make a difference? So, good genes are good habits are really important, but actually your mentality is really, it's those old motherhood and apple pie. How you think really does matter to how you feel. And the one phrase that the happiness study on aging found was, if you tell people and yourself, these are the good days, and it's just about the only thing that will move your hedonic level, your baseline level up. And the more up you are, also, the more likely you are to meet that friend for the walk. The more likely you are to take that step that you need to take as well. The more likely you are to be a good person in that relationship, not just be good to yourself. So these are the good days. Add that into your day.
Yeah, and I like to say, Laura, on top of that, I would say, I've learned this, every day is a gift, right? So now what are you going to do with it, right? And I think if you have that kind of that mindset, as you just said, I think it puts you in a positive headspace to kind of say, okay, so how are we going to make the most of this gift that we've been given?
So speaking of that, Dr. Sinha, you have a number of patients who are centenarians, and do you find there's any sort of perspective they have that's different than others, or how did they get there? And I think from speaking to you in the past, some of them are pretty active people out in the world enjoying life. So is there anything that they're doing, any kind of perspective, as Laura noted, that helps
You know,
beyond?
yeah, it's such a privilege, right? It's like, caring for all of my patients is such an enormous privilege, and I really lean into kind of, thinking about what makes these particular individuals special. I think, having that positive attitude, having that sense of resilience, being grateful for what you have, and also having that perspective, not sweating the small stuff, right? And realizing, like, in the grand scheme of things, holding that grudge and being angry is just going to make you feel worse, and it's going to make everyone around you feel worse. And so I love that kind of that attitude. I love that idea of that sense of kind of, had 90 to 100 years to crystallize that knowledge, so they know what needs to be thought about and what doesn't need to be considered. I mean, there's other things, right? I think it's about being socially, like, these are folks who often are staying socially connected and engaged. They want to read the news. I remember my one of my centenarians, she was getting really frustrated that she couldn't read her newspaper, and I said to her, well, what we need to do is, she was at a retirement home, I said, let's get you an iPad. And this particular newspaper, they actually have a little button beside every article, so that you can actually just listen to it. And when we got our audiobooks through the Toronto Public Library, because she used to be the head of her book club, she could rejoin her book club and stay engaged. And the best part was when I checked in with her and said, so now you've got the audiobooks, you're back in the book club, what do you think? And she made me laugh. She said, it's great being back in the book club, but not loving all of their selections. And then I'm like, well, maybe you should run for president of the book club again. She's like, no, that time has passed, and I don't have time for that right now. So I just love this idea of staying engaged, staying connected, asking for help to do so. And then one of my patients, who I absolutely adored, till he passed away at 102, he was a retired physician, and he and I bonded because we loved to eat sardines. So he would say sardines are key, and I actually think sardines are phenomenal. So maybe that there's something there to it as well. But again, these are the things that I've been learning from my centenarians. It's really about attitude. It's about staying active. It's staying connected and not sweating the small stuff.
I was going to ask you about the sardines, so I'm glad that you brought them up. I think now is a really good time to move to some of our questions from the attendees. There's so many, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to them. So I think I will start with the fact that there are a number that sort of merge together on different themes, such as a good health span, or the flip side of that question is, what are 3 things to eliminate? And I know you spoke to some of those earlier on, but are there any other ideas? And perhaps even Laura, before we go to Dr. Sinha, what do you think? I mean, just in terms of like social issues or anything else, what would you get rid of to help improve your lifespan?
At the individual level, I would get rid of a sense, as again, whether is it about age or fear? Like I would get rid of that bucket word old, and actually really just have a look at what's in there for you, because it may not be the same things that's in there for somebody else. I just get rid of that word. And I have to say, I get rid of everything that's got these number cutoffs to them. Like, most of these numbers came out of things that make no sense. The story behind 65, and it's been told enough times, I think it might be something like true, is that Otto von Bismarck needed to pay a pension to his soldiers, and the highest ranking, oldest soldier was 67. So he made that 75, which was sort of like making a pension at 120. And then he needed, a political boost 10 years later and lowered it to 65. And that was done, at a time where nobody lived that long. And when we think about, our healthcare systems, like the age-based triage, some of these numbers or old ideas make no sense. They're just not based on who we are anymore. So really, when you're looking at just those numbers, I get rid of those and try to say, what is it we're trying to achieve? And what do we need to know now? So I get rid of that. The last thing I would just get rid of is this sense that you are alone in being annoyed that things keep changing. My almost 89-year-old mother was really mad because all the stuff on her computer system and her phone was looking different and nothing was working anymore. And we came, and it would be easy to say, oh, she's just out of date with technology. No, it was the new iOS system was really annoying. And I just had an experience as well. But she felt embarrassed. She felt embarrassed because she didn't know how to deal with this. I said, listen, we all feel like that. I feel like that with my kid. The rate of change is so fast right now that our hesitancy about not wanting to look stupid or not wanting to look out of touch or not wanting to be good at something, if you could just get rid of that, you'll find out that mostly everybody is feeling the same way. Be willing to be bad at something is so much more empowering as we age. And that's one of those things that when we look back and you look at regret, so many people said, I wish I'd done this, or I wish I'd gone traveling, or I wish I'd, tried that job, or I wish. Don't be held back by the sense of fear or shame or the state of change. Turns out probably everyone's feeling the same way.
Another attendee named Linda N asks, are there any yearly medical tests I should get after the age of 65? Dr. Sinha?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there's again, this idea of the annual health physical has actually almost been debunked now as something that you need to go and get this annual kind of ritual where a doctor looks you over and all these things. I think you should A, have a primary care provider, B, try and see them at least annually and kind of ask that question, are there any things that I should be doing? There's not a test that we say you should get done every year, but as Laura and I often advocate for collectively, is there are vaccines that we should be getting every single year, and there are other vaccines that are age-based, proven by science to say at this age this is the vaccine you should have, and that. So, but by checking in with your regular healthcare provider, let them know how's it going. Is there anything holding you back? Because that's when I then look at my older patient and say, okay, well, that's not normal. That actually, kind of comes with wear and tear and mileage. And now, by you telling me these things, I know what tests we need to do. So now I need to know if I need to screen you for cognitive impairment or dementia. I need to know we have to do a cancer workup, or if we have to think about your heart and your lung, or see how your blood pressure is doing. So I would say there's not an annual test, but I would say make sure that you do an annual check-in with your healthcare provider. Ask them, am I up to date on my vaccines? Here's what's going on. Is there anything I should be worried about? And by having that sort of an approach, and as Laura was saying, getting rid of the numbers, you're going to make sure that you're actually making sure that your healthcare needs are being appropriately addressed to help you stay healthy and independent for as long as possible.
And you saw me point to my ears. I really mean it. Like, one of the most important things you can do, and people skip all the time, is get your hearing checked. It is one of those areas that makes a huge difference for social isolation and loneliness, because you can't hear anything anymore. You can't have a one-to-one conversation. Maybe you can say something, but then you can't have an exchange, or you can't go to a social event, or you can't go when there's a group of people. It also, creates great frustration in relationships. Right? Nobody likes that. And for yourself, it increases your chances of getting dementia, as well as affects your balance. So a hearing test is one of those things people often skip. And as you get older, people say, oh, I'm just getting older. My hearing's not as good as it used to be. No, you can actually do lots of things now. And eyes need to be checked more often. So again, not just, every 2 years or 5 years. No, you need to get your eyes checked quite often, because they can change much more regularly. I like people to get their balance checked. You don't have to go to a healthcare provider for your balance check. There's things that you can do yourself, and including, can you get up out of a chair without holding your hands. Things like your balance make a huge difference in your life. I would like to advocate for a legal check-in. I'll put my lawyer hat on for a second. Because one of the things you're trying to do is plan ahead, or plan for yourself, or plan for your well-being. Many people forget we only have about a third of Canadians who have wills or powers of attorney. And it's a big mess if you don't have them. And in many parts of Canada, you don't need a lawyer or pay someone to do them. There's now computer systems. As a lawyer, I would like you to go to get legal advice. But there's some of those worries that what's going to cost, a huge amounts of money are not always borne out. But it's really important that you get your legal stuff done as much as it is to get your health stuff done.
That's so interesting. And I know that a lot of us will listen to, for example, podcasts that talk about all kinds of different things that we should be doing to prepare for aging. And people talk about lots of different possibilities, but there's still only possibilities through animal testing and so on. So there's a lot of information coming out there. So one of our listeners, Cal G, is asking about the recommended daily vitamins or minerals. And in particular, he's asking about should he be taking resveratrol, omega-3, and QC10. So perhaps Dr. Sinha, could you speak to that?
Yeah, no, and it's important, right? Because I think the key is right now, if you're on social media, and particularly, like, everyone has something that they're selling, to tell you, you take this or you do that, or you do a cold plunge, for example. That was the hot trend a little while ago, that this is going to help you live longer and stuff. And so when my patients ask me about, okay, vitamins, like, what's the deal? What do I need to be doing? First of all, we all need to have vitamins and minerals, to maintain a healthy life. Now, the key is if you're actually having a good regular diet, you're probably getting your essential vitamins and minerals. However, as we age, there are certain things we need to be mindful of. So we need to make sure we're getting adequate dietary calcium. If you're not getting adequate dietary calcium, then you need to take a calcium supplement. Everybody needs to be taking some vitamin D every day, at least 1,000 international units. We're living, quite far north. We get less sun, and vitamin D and calcium build stronger bones. And then when it comes to other things, I put you on an iron supplement if your iron is low. I put you on a B12 supplement if your B12 is low. And I, put you on an additional vitamin D supplement if your vitamin D levels are low. So these are the core things that we want to check on. In terms of some of these other things, for example, you're probably getting enough of them through your regular diet. And when patients say to me, well, what about a daily multivitamin? Yeah, sure. There's no harm in that. But often, speak to your healthcare provider, because sometimes I have patients who come in with all sorts of supplements and other things, which can be very, very expensive. And I just say, hey, you probably don't need to take extra vitamin C every day because you don't have scurvy and you're getting enough in your diet. And so, you're probably just, it's just kind of passing through you, but it's not adding extra benefits. So check with your healthcare provider to see, what do you need to be on? Because sometimes I do prescribe certain vitamins and minerals if there's a deficiency. But, when you go into any, pharmacy or any health food store, they're going to tell you need to be taking everything on the shelf. And that's not the case for most people.
Another listener, Peter Y, asks, how does sleep contribute to living longer, or does it contribute to living longer? I know, Dr. Sinha, we'll come back to you, but Laura, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well. So what do you think?
As a middle-aged woman, I sure do. Listen, sleep is one of those magic kind of things that we always know is good, right? I've never been a great sleeper, and lots of us have harder times in later life. So we have to try to figure out what matters. Does it matter? Yes, it really does. It's when your brain recharges, right? You actually need time to let things sink in. If you are managing other kinds of health conditions, you need to have that good deep rest. Sometimes, based on the individual person, you may have sleep in different ways. So if you're a shift worker, for instance, me telling you to go to bed at 10 o'clock every night and wake up at 7 o'clock every morning isn't real, because if you're working, the the graveyard shift, that's not it. So it's not a one size fits all kind of regime, but you do need adequate rest. As we get older, lots of people take naps in the day. I like a nap right now, I have to say. There's lots of research out there about naps. So understand that there's a lot of work right now around sleep. It isn't just a one size fits all. People do have different sleep patterns, but do try to make sure that you are doing those good sleep hygiene things. I can't tell you the number of times, like eat right and exercise. Don't watch, certain things right before bed. Try to have an environment, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we often forget about, though, is we think about it as I'm not a good sleeper, but we don't ask the question, why? Is it incontinence? Well, then it's not really a sleep problem, it's a continence problem. And we should be talking about what it is that you need to do around your continence. If you're up 3 and 4 times a night, maybe we need to do some tests about your continence. It's not really about your sleep. Pain and arthritis is one of those really common things that affects sleep. And, I'm excited about some things that are happening right now in medical science. I'm excited about the beginning of some dementia meds, the beginning of some new approaches to arthritis, beginnings to thinking about how joints function. Like these are all kind of just on the cusp of really getting great stuff out there. But don't just assume you're not a good sleeper. Really figure out what it is. And lots of people will have normalized pain, particularly arthritis or other joint pains or their back pains. So they don't even recognize that they're in pain because it's just where they are all the time. And it's not like dropping a thing on your foot and you go, ow, it's this sort of baseline and you need to move around a lot and so on. So the other thing you have to do is you have to ask yourself, are you being woken up by the person who might be beside you or in the other room? So sometimes it's good to think about it. Sometimes when we get older, marriages are often saved by 2 beds. And so think about it again, not these social norms, but really address yourself. What is affecting your pain? Is it important sleep? It absolutely is. You need to take it as seriously as anything else. Now, maybe the medical doctor could give you even better information than that.
Really quickly adding on to what Laura's saying, absolutely good sleep is important, especially the older we get, because as we get older, we don't tend to sleep as deeply as we once did. So our sleep is more prone to interruptions. So as Laura was saying, like, are there factors like pain or other aspects, that are actually interfering with your ability to get a good sleep at night? And then what are also the other things that can be mindful that you're not going to have that natural deep sleep, as you age. So, sleep hygiene, the quick things are, a cool, dark room, ideally 19 degrees Celsius apparently is the perfect temperature. That's what I set mine at now. Make sure that it's dark. Don't leave the lights on. Don't have the screens with you. Those sorts of things that actually can help you create a good environment that promotes good sleep, because there is emerging evidence to suggest that making sure that you get good quality, adequate sleep can actually reduce your future risk of dementia as well. It's one of those things where the scientists are working on that to figure out how important is that as a factor, but it's on the watch list. So it's one of those sorts of things where you got to really think about making sure that we're being attentive to as we age.
Not to think about it too much just as you're trying to fall asleep, because you might not get there. All those worries. We just have a few minutes left, so I have one quick question I'm hoping both of you can touch upon, because I think a lot of people are curious about this, and people are asking about arthritis and joint pain and so on. So again, maybe we can just sort of touch upon this in a slightly deeper way. Laura, what do you think?
Well, I come from a family riddled with arthritis, and I'm rubbing my knee as we speak. And my daughter is one of the spokespeople for the Arthritis Society. So this is a near and dear thing to my heart. Talk about arthritis. It's not age. It's actually a medical condition, right? It's important to know that you can get arthritis at any age, and many young people have arthritis. So don't just say, oh, it's old age. No, it is actually a medical condition. And if you find another healthcare provider that's kind of dismissing it, it's important to make sure that you tell that person, this is what it's affecting my life, right? I can't, it's not just I can't get my rings on and off, or I can't go visit my friend because I can't walk there anymore, or it hurts me in the morning, or I'm waking up at night. So take joint pain, I think, very seriously. And there's good stuff that you can do beyond just, taking something kind of off a shelf. There's lots of good things you can do for joint pain.
Dr. Sinha, we have just about a minute left.
Yeah, no. I mean, the quick thing is, again, just don't assume, that arthritis is just due to old age. There's different types of arthritis, and some of the arthritis, like osteoarthritis, is more associated with wear and tear. There are other inflammatory forms of arthritis and so on. So again, if you're having joint pain or other joint issues, speak to a healthcare provider. And, actually, again, back to those motherhood and apple pie things, regular exercise is actually one of the best things people can do who have arthritis. And then you can also think about, if pain is a symptom, maybe there are topical things that you can do that are not the form of a pill. And sometimes there are, certain kind of mild pain medications one can take that can, again, help you manage the pain so you can keep moving, so you can better manage your arthritis. So again, there is a science behind this, and it's good to seek help to make sure that you can deal with that well as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Toronto Star, I would really like to say thank you to Laura Tamblyn Watts and Dr. Samir Sinha. This was such an interesting conversation. I've learned so much, even though I've been writing about these issues for years, so I really appreciate your time. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. The registration numbers again and the questions show that there really is a growing and compelling interest in these issues. And much gratitude to the sponsor, Genicol, which creates products focused on joint health. Again, one of today's guests will win a gift basket with a 1-year supply of Genicol products. The Star will be contacting the winner after this event via email. And I hope you all follow and listen to our podcast, How to Live to 100 or Die Trying. Thank you so much.